A few years ago, a colleague of mine decided to take a long road trip through what he called the heartland, the vast rural stretches of the American Midwest.
Right.
And he went in with a very specific image in his mind.
The classic stereotype, I imagine.
Totally. A landscape of aging white farmers, dusty tractors, and boarded-up shop fronts. He called it a place frozen in time, basically.
Mm-hmm.
He even packed a physical atlas, half expecting his GPS to fail the moment he left the interstate, assuming these areas were, essentially off the grid.
Disconnected from the modern world.
Exactly. But as he moved through these small towns, he experienced this strange kind of cognitive dissonance.
The reality didn't match the picture.
Not even close. In a tiny community he expected to be homogenous and struggling, he found a vibrant Mexican grocery store just buzzing with activity.
Oh, interesting.
And at a local diner, the conversation wasn't about the weather or the harvest. It was a group of young logistics managers discussing how a strike in a port halfway across the world was delaying their supply chain. So completely globalized.
Completely. He saw high-tech manufacturing hubs where he expected empty fields and a racial diversity that honestly rivaled the suburbs he'd left behind.
And how did he react to that?
That's the fascinating part. He told me later he felt this bizarre sense of irritation.
Irritation, not surprise.
Irritation. It wasn't that the prosperity or the diversity bothered him at all. It was that his brain felt lied to. He couldn't reconcile the complex, globalized reality with the simple, backward postcard he'd been carrying in his head for decades.
That disconnect is so common. It's not just a personal oversight, or a lack of travel. It's a symptom of something much deeper.
It really is. We like to think of ourselves as rational observers, but the truth is we are trying to navigate a hyper-connected global village using hardware designed for a 50-person tribe on the African savanna.
We're running 21st century software on Stone Age processors.
Exactly. And the rural myth is one of our most persistent system glitches. That story really forces us to confront the limitations we all carry with us.
It does. It frames the core issue not as a failure of policy or education, but as a failure of our biology to just keep pace with modern scale.
Which leads to the fundamental question of this whole deep dive.
Right. Why do we cling so tightly to these simplified monolithic myths that rural areas are homogeneous, disconnected, inherently backward, when the reality right in front of us is demonstrably complex, diverse, and globally integrated?
It's the cognitive mismatch at its absolute finest. And our mission here is to really excavate the biological and evolutionary reasons that ancient hardware that compel our brains to simplify these complex modern social geographies.
But we can't stop there. We have to see how this cognitive glitch drives real, tangible political, economic, and social divisions today.
Exactly, because the political conflicts you see on the news are, in many ways, just the surface manifestation of a profound biological constraint.
Okay, so let's unpack this biological wall because it really does establish the hard boundaries of our thinking. And it seems to start with a concept known as the social brain hypothesis.
The social brain hypothesis, or SBH, yeah. It's really the foundational understanding for human social complexity.
And what's the core idea?
Well, the idea is that the major driver for the evolution of the large brain in primates, and especially the massive expansion of our neocortex, was the cognitive demand of just managing a complex social life.
So the bigger and more complicated your group got, the more brain power you needed just to keep track of everyone.
To put it simply, yes. Keeping track of who's allied with whom, who's a rival, who owes you a favor. All of that social chess required more and more neural tissue.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense, but there's a huge evolutionary price tag that came with growing that hardware, right?
Absolutely. The brain is an extraordinarily expensive organ. In adult humans, it's only about 2% of our body mass.
But it uses, what, like a fifth of our energy?
About 20% of the body's total metabolic energy budget. That's a huge energetic cost.
Yeah.
So throughout our evolutionary history, there's this continuous, brutal trade-off.
A trade-off between
the survival benefits of group living things, like better defense against predators, coordinated hunting against the exceptionally high cost of maintaining and evolving larger brain tissue.
And our neocortex, the part that does all the heavy thinking, is basically the result of that cost-benefit analysis.
That's a great way to put it. The neocortex volume we have in modern humans is what dictates our computational capacity for social interaction. It sets a physical, hard limit on the number of individuals with whom you can maintain a stable, functional social relationship.
And when you say stable, what does that really mean?
It means a relationship where you genuinely know The person, their history, their personality, and you can predict how they'll interact with other people in the group. It's not just knowing their name.
And that leads us directly to the specific boundary, the famous Dunbar's number. What is the precise cognitive constraint we're dealing with?
The boundary for maintaining those stable relationships is estimated to be around 150 individuals.
150.
Right. And that figure isn't a casual suggestion. It represents the maximum limit for effective individual recognition.
So beyond that, our brains just can't keep up.
The cognitive load becomes unsustainable. Think about it. If you have n individuals, the number of potential relationships you have to track is n squared. When n hits a 150, that becomes cognitively overwhelming, but it's still manageable. Push it much higher, and the system breaks down without some kind of external structure, like a hierarchy.
What's really remarkable about this is how reliably that number just popped up. When you look at human organizations throughout history, it suggests it's a real biological constraint, not just some cultural preference.
You see evidence for it everywhere. Take the Hutterite communities, for example. They're a religious sect with a long history of maintaining these communal cooperative structures.
And what did they figure out?
They discovered empirically, just through trial and error, that when their communities get to or slightly exceed 150 members, they have to split.
They have to. Why?
Because if they don't, pro-social behavior starts to break down. To maintain cooperation and enforce norms above that number, they realized they'd need an imposed institutional discipline, a formal police force, essentially.
So for them, 150 is literally the boundary of self-governing cooperation.
It is. And it's not just in small communes. You even see it in highly rigid, high-stakes organizations, like the military.
The military, how so?
Military units are a fascinating data point. If you look at the company, which is traditionally the smallest unit that can act independently for a sustained period.
Meaning it doesn't need constant orders from higher up?
Exactly. When you examine the size of companies across various armies in World War II, doesn't matter what country, what technology, the mean size clustered at 177.7 troops.
Which is pretty darn close to 150.
And crucially, the variance around that average was remarkably small. It strongly suggests there's a natural, efficient organizational scale for cohesion and independent action that sits very tightly around that 150 marker.
So 150 is the scale where cooperation, trust, and individual recognition just work naturally. If we go past that, the whole system changes.
It does. The nature of cooperation is different. Beyond the 150 limit, altruism and cooperation stop being based on intimate knowledge or trust.
They become transactional.
Precisely. They become subject to stringent, explicit cost-benefit evaluations. Unqualified, unquestioning altruism, the kind you give without thinking, that largely remains confined to our established 150 relationships.
Which almost always includes our family and closest friends.
Invariably. This really sounds like a societal application of Hamilton's rule, which explains why we invest so heavily in our kin.
That's exactly the evolutionary logic driving it. Hamilton's rule, in its most basic form, says that altruistic behavior is favored by selection if the cost to you is less than the benefit to the recipient, weighted by how related you are.
So you're more likely to risk your life for 2 siblings than for 8 cousins, because the genetic payoff is higher.
Exactly. Now, scale that up to modern society. If you're dealing with people outside your 150 limit, that relatedness factor, even culturally, drops off a cliff. The cognitive cost of figuring out if a social exchange is worthwhile becomes mandatory. You can't rely on implicit trust.
And when you scale that up to the level of millions, that individual cost-benefit analysis becomes literally impossible.
Which brings us right to the consequence of this constraint when we apply it to a modern nation-state. This is the monolith trap.
Yes, the heart of the evolutionary mismatch we're talking about.
So what happens when the brain encounters a category with millions of people? A category like the rural population or Appalachia or the American Midwest.
It hits that n-squared capacity limit multiple times over. It cannot possibly perform the individual categorization, the tracking, the management needed to process a social network of that scale.
The mental effort required is just too much.
It's unsustainable for the human brain. To try and recognize and appreciate the unique values, economic situations, and diversity of millions of distinct people across thousands of miles, our hardware just isn't built for it.
So instead of crashing from the cognitive exhaustion, our brain performs a radical energy-saving maneuver.
It executes a massive cognitive shortcut, a classification heuristic designed to conserve mental energy.
It replaces all that exhausting complexity and diversity
with a single, simplified, monolithic, rural prototype or myth. And this isn't driven by malice or even conscious bias. It's a strategy of irrationality rooted in evolutionary efficiency. Our ancient hardware will always prioritize saving mental energy over factual accuracy when dealing with the distant, massive groups.
I recently read about a software architect named Elias who had built his career on solving these incredibly complex logistical problems in a big coastal city. He decided to take a long cross-country road trip, to see the real world, as he put it. But as he drove through the Midwest and watched people at diners and gas stations, he noticed something unnerving about his own perception.
What was it?
He wasn't seeing people. He was seeing characters. His brain was filtering every person, the weathered skin, the slow drawl, the flannel shirt, into a singular rural prototype.
He was experiencing the monolith trap in real time.
Exactly. He realized later that his ancient cognitive architecture, the same hardware designed for his 150-person tribe back home, was actively refusing to recognize the individuality of millions of people who fell outside his immediate circle.
And for all his technical sophistication, his brain defaulted to the cheapest, most energy-efficient processing mode. It's a profound realization that because those millions of people were not part of his Dunbar's number, his brain just wouldn't permit the complex, individualized recognition needed to see the software engineers or the global logistics managers hidden under that stereotype.
It really makes you feel a genuine sense of loss, a kind of grief for the depth of human experience and unique reality that gets erased by our own biological inability to scale our social recognition beyond 150 people.
The monolith trap is less about ignorance and more about a hardwired necessary failure to process a massive, complex data set.
And the problem intensifies because this simplification, this monolith trap, it's not just a passive filter.
No, it's not. It activates our most basic social survival mechanisms, the hardwiring that relies on rapid categorization to determine friend, resource, or enemy.
And when you scale that up to modern society, it shows up as pervasive tribalistic bias, shaping how we allocate power and resources.
We move from just simplifying the map to drawing aggressive boundaries on it between us and them.
This is where the outgroup homogeneity effect plays such a critical role.
Exactly. The outgroup homogeneity effect is a direct consequence of this tribalistic hardwiring. When you look at social groups, the in-group, and let's define this broadly as maybe the urban knowledge class, the policy-making elite, or the coastal cosmopolitan population.
Okay.
That group perceives itself as internally diverse, nuanced, and highly individuated.
Right. We're all unique individuals.
But when they turn that same lens onto the outgroup, the rural population, they view them as highly similar, lacking complex personality, and easily characterized by a simple, often negative archetype.
The rural myth becomes the perfect psychological vehicle for this effect. It lets the in-group maintain its complex, positive self-image while reducing the outgroup to a predictable caricature.
And this has profound material consequences. This process of flattening the rural world into a homogeneous, singular other provides a potent psychological justification for the in-group to strategically allocate resources disproportionately to their own geographic centers.
And we're talking about everything from money to political attention.
Financial capital, political attention, infrastructure investment, cultural capital, all of it.
When you describe it that way, allocating resources based on tribal bias, it sounds like conscious malice, but you're arguing this happens on a subconscious systemic level.
It is the manifestation of deep-seated tribalism projected onto the scale of the modern state. It ties right back to Hamilton's rule again, favoring those who share similar cultural genes or are just closer to the center of power. So if a policymaker in a city relying on that monolithic myth genuinely believes a rural region is just focused on low-tech industries,
then allocating fiber optic grants or high-speed transit funding somewhere else seems like an economically rational decision, not a punitive one. The bias is built right into the perception of need.
and beyond just the policy decisions, the narrative itself becomes a kind of social currency within the in-group.
Absolutely. The very act of adopting or rejecting these simplified, often disparaging narratives about rural life. It functions as a powerful status signaling mechanism within that urban knowledge class.
How does that work?
By confirming the myth about the outgroup, by lamenting the supposed backwardness of the periphery, you consolidate ideological alignment and you affirm your membership within the privileged, forward-thinking in-group.
It's a way of saying, I understand the modern world, unlike them. That's it, exactly.
The economics of this cognitive shortcut are just stark. When this flawed perception drives policy, it leads to tangible, on-the-ground economic harm that is so difficult to reverse. And we have a really compelling illustration of this, the story of Sarah.
Yes, Sarah's case highlights the specific failure of the outgroup homogeneity effect. She was an entrepreneur running a sophisticated digital marketing firm from a renovated barn in a remote county.
So already breaking the stereotype.
Completely. She was competing successfully on a global scale, but her business was constantly hampered by slow, unreliable internet access.
So when her local school board fought for federal and state grants for high-speed fiber optics, they ran straight into the monolith trap.
They did. State-level policymakers, operating 300 miles away in the capital, consistently categorized Sarah's region as nothing more than traditional farmland.
Their cognitive bias was just that powerful.
So powerful that they strategically allocated the fiber optic grants elsewhere, assuming her town didn't possess the complex, diverse economic needs of the urban core. The assumption was that the limited funds were better spent where they would be better utilized, meaning in the cities.
That is a structural misreading that resulted in real economic strangulation. A sophisticated, future-focused business like Sarah's was deliberately choked out, or at least severely handicapped, because of a powerful person's cognitive inability to imagine diversity outside of their immediate 150-person social circle.
It's sobering. And this systemic oversight inevitably creates the conditions for genuine, deep-seated, place-based resentment among rural and suburban populations. And this resentment isn't uniform. You can break it down into 3 specific measurable components.
Okay, let's detail these 3 forms of resentment. I think they're crucial to understanding the political polarization we see today.
First, you have political resentment. This is the feeling of being fundamentally ignored by political elites.
They don't care about us.
Exactly. It's the core belief that their specific geographic area has no genuine voice, that they're systemically underrepresented in both the media and government. It's about being denied agency.
Okay. And the second component targets the distribution of public funds and infrastructure.
That's economic resentment. This is the perception of being last in line for essential public spending. It covers everything from the quality of roads and schools to access to quality healthcare.
So a feeling of being unfairly treated in how resources are distributed.
That's right. Believing that the government dedicates too much developmental spending to urban centers, while their own growth potential is ignored or actively neglected.
And the third one, which the data often shows is the most potent and emotionally charged.
That would be cultural resentment. This is the deep, stinging sense of social marginalization. The belief that their lifestyle, their traditions, their core moral values are fundamentally disrespected and looked down upon by the urban outgroup.
It's about dignity and perceived social status.
It is. The sentiment is, people in those other areas do not respect our lifestyle. And when you look at the empirical data, rural residents consistently exhibit the highest levels of all 3, but that cultural resentment often serves as the primary emotional fuel.
So we have a complex reality, clear evidence of diversity, measurable economic harm caused by this myth, and yet the stereotype persists. Why? Why don't facts and data just dissolve it?
This is where error management theory, or EMT, gives us a powerful evolutionary answer.
Okay, explain EMT.
EMT provides an adaptive explanation for why biases persist even when they seem irrational in the modern world. The central principle is that natural selection doesn't necessarily favor accuracy.
It doesn't. What does it favor?
It favors the psychological strategy that carries the lowest cost for survival, even if that means making frequent, low-consequence errors. It's an adaptive trade-off.
The classic survival heuristic clarifies this immediately.
It's the perfect analogy. Imagine our ancestors walking through tall grass. If they mistake a coiled stick for a snake, that's a false positive.
The cost is low. You jump, get a little scared, waste a few seconds.
Right. Now consider the reverse. Mistaking a venomous snake for a stick, that's a false negative. The cost is incredibly high potential death.
So because the cost of one error so vastly outweighs the other, the brain is adapted to just err on the side of caution.
It's wired to be suspicious of ambiguous stimuli and to over-categorize threats. And if we apply that primal survival logic to the complex social decision-making of the 21st century, we see exactly why stereotypes survive. It's a cost-benefit calculation for the ancient brain.
So it's a calculation of cognitive and administrative effort.
Precisely. When we apply EMT to policy and resource allocation at a societal scale, the analysis is stark.
The low-cost error is just maintaining the simple, unified rural myth.
Correct. For the urban in-group, maintaining that belief, even if it's factually wrong, has an incredibly low cognitive cost. It requires zero mental effort to challenge the existing idea. And it has a low administrative cost for policymakers. They can use one simple formula for grants or aid and minimize bureaucratic complexity.
And on the flip side, the high-cost effort is what reality actually demands.
Yes. Investing immense administrative resources, hiring local experts, dedicating cognitive bandwidth, and spending significant time to truly understand and respond to the unique, differentiated needs of thousands of distinct rural communities.
That effort is monumentally costly and time-consuming.
And it carries the risk of internal political conflict because of the increased complexity. So the brain's inherent cost-benefit analysis rooted in survival logic favors the cognitive shortcut. It prefers relying on existing stereotypes because it minimizes cost.
Which leads to this profound policy inertia. It's just cheaper for the system than admitting true heterogeneity.
The persistence of the myth isn't just about media consumption, then. It's a ghost of our ancestors trying to keep us alive, telling us to conserve energy and assume the unknown is simple or hostile.
So stereotypes are functioning as powerful survival heuristics, as flawed as they are in a modern context.
They absolutely are. And you see this instinctual defensiveness play out constantly in situations of ambiguity. Take the experience of a traveler. Let's call him Marcus.
Okay.
Imagine Marcus gets a flat tire on a deeply rural back road in Appalachia as dusk is settling. He's tired, anxious, and immediately this irrational panic sets in, the kind of fear fueled by every isolated rural threat trope he's ever seen in a movie.
Right.
So when a local man in a beat-out truck pulls over to offer help, Marcus's first defensive instinct isn't simple gratitude, it's deep suspicion.
His brain, in that moment, is running that evolutionary trade-off. It's textbook error management theory.
It is cognitively and emotionally cheaper for his evolutionary survival to be wrong about a threat, to suspect a genuinely helpful person, than to be wrong about safety. That instinctual suspicion is the primal brain clinging to the stereotype, because stereotypes are fast-acting heuristics designed to keep us safe in the face of the unknown.
It's frustrating, but it's a critical reminder. We have to acknowledge that while these biases are biologically natural, they are the very evolutionary glitches we need to consciously install a critical thinking software patch to overcome.
And to move toward that critical thinking patch, we need to apply a more sophisticated sociological lens. We cannot treat the rural-urban discussion as a simple dichotomy.
It's not just black and white.
No, it is a continuum. And critically, that continuum has to incorporate the often forgotten third category, the suburbs.
The history of political theory often focused just on the city versus the farm, leaving the sprawling suburbs out of the discussion.
But social identity theory, or SIT, brings these populations back into focus by highlighting the power of place as a driver of group identity.
And SIT is key here, isn't it?
It is. It tells us that where we live acts as an incredibly potent social identity, powerfully driving in-group versus out-group categorization and behavior. This framework requires that people categorize themselves subjectively as urban, suburban, or rural, often regardless of objective criteria like population density or zip code.
So it's about how you see yourself. And does this place-based identity play out equally across the three categories?
Not at all. We see very clear differences. Rural residents consistently exhibit the highest level of place-based identity. For them, their place of living, the countryside, the small town, is profoundly internalized as part of their self-concept.
It dictates their values, their lifestyle,
and their worldview.
I would guess that urban dwellers, being more mobile and cosmopolitan, would show the lowest place-based identity. But what about the suburban population?
Interestingly, urbanites and suburbanites show equally low levels of place-based identity.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it makes structural sense when you consider the function of suburbs. They often function as bedroom communities.
Places where you just sleep?
Exactly. Residents primarily only sleep there. They commute elsewhere into the city for work or to other suburbs for shopping and leisure. If your primary life functions happen outside your municipality, the depth of identity you feel with that place is predictably low.
Okay, so we have highly identified rural populations and low identity among both urban and suburban populations. Now, let's connect this back to the resentment we were talking about. Do the people with the strongest identity also hold the strongest resentment?
Generally, yes. The levels of place-based resentment strongly mirror the identity differences. Rural residents hold the highest levels of resentment across all three dimensions: political, economic, and cultural.
And suburbanites are in the middle.
They follow, showing higher resentment than urbanites. And that cultural resentment, that deep sense of disrespect for their lifestyle and values, is particularly heightened among rural residents.
This is where the interaction between place-based identity and resentment becomes so critical. Does high identity just mean you're more resentful, or does the identity act as a mechanism that sharpens the divide?
It functions as a powerful moderator. It sharpens divisions specifically among those who care most about their place. When your place-based identity is high, when you feel your location is central to who you are, you're more likely to engage in social comparison with the outgroup.
And that comparison intensifies the perceived social gaps. And since the urban-centric narrative often positions the rural world as the inferior status group, that social comparison is inherently negative for the high-identity rural resident.
Exactly. And we find a critical finding here. The rural-urban divide in resentment increases significantly when place-based identity is high.
So it's the combination of high identity and perceived lower status that fuels the resentment.
It is. Rural residents who internalize their identity while seeing themselves as the inferior status group are much more likely to develop deep, abiding resentment.
The structural resentment must then translate into political attitudes, right? Specifically, trust in institutions. If you feel marginalized, you might stop trusting the system that marginalizes you.
This leads us to look at specific political support, which measures things like political trust in existing institutions like the government, the parliament, political parties. And initially, the descriptive divide in this trust is surprisingly small.
So on the surface, it looks like everyone trusts the system about the same.
Right. It's not substantially different across the continuum, which you might take as a sign of underlying democratic stability. But this descriptive calmness completely hides dramatic inversion that occurs when we factor in the identity moderator.
Okay, let's look closely at this inversion of political trust. How does high place-based identity flip the script on who trusts the government the most?
When place-based identity is low meaning, your location is not a defining part of who you are. Rural residents actually exhibit higher levels of political trust than their urban or suburban counterparts.
That's a really important baseline fact. So absent that identity weight, they're quite trusting.
But the moment that identity becomes central to who they are,
the picture inverts.
Precisely. When place-based identity is high, the divide is inverted. Rural residents exhibit the lowest level of political trust compared to urbanites. This is the critical finding.
So the drop in political support, fueled by resentment, only really manifests in those for whom the geographic category is a salient part of their self-concept.
Which shows how political actors or media narratives that deliberately activate or reinforce that place-based identity by running campaigns focused on rural grievances are actively widening the systemic trust gap.
The quiet, generalized political support that exists when identity is passive is dramatically undercut the moment a sense of place is activated. And this identity moderator must also help us understand the flight toward more diffuse forms of political support, not just trusting the current government, but the preference for the system itself.
That's where the geography of autocracy emerges. When we look at diffuse political support, which is regime preference, specifically the preference for democracy versus authoritarian alternatives like rule by the army or a strong leader.
A clear geographical divide appears.
A clear and deeply concerning divide. Rural residents show a significantly stronger preference for authoritarian regimes than urban dwellers.
Okay, now we get to the core of the conflict. If political trust alone doesn't explain this gap in regime preference, what mechanisms are truly driving this preference for authoritarian alternatives in rural areas?
It is fundamentally socioeconomic and cultural. Our analysis investigated three potential sets of explanations: political dissatisfaction, socioeconomic factors, and cultural factors.
And the findings on political dissatisfaction are surprisingly weak.
They're almost irrelevant. Measures of political resentment or specific political trust explain almost none, about 1% of the rural-urban divide in regime preference.
That's a crucial finding for policymakers.
It is. It means simply giving rural areas more political representation or making them trust the government more will not solve their underlying preference for non-democratic alternatives. The problem runs far deeper than institutional failure.
So if we can basically toss out the political trust explanation, where is the overwhelming majority of the conflict rooted?
The divide is overwhelmingly mediated by socioeconomic and cultural factors. Together, these two mechanisms explain a massive 70% of the rural-urban divide in regime preference.
70%.
And within the socioeconomic category, the single strongest driver is education, followed by income.
So the fact that urban centers naturally contain more highly educated populations is a huge factor.
It is. And those populations demonstrate a significantly stronger, non-negotiable preference for a democratic system.
And the rest of that 70% is driven by differences in lifestyle and core values.
Precisely. Cultural factors, specifically moral values and the ethnic conception of nationhood, are the other primary drivers. Rural residents tend to be more strongly inclined toward traditional conservative moral values and a more restrictive ethnic definition of who truly belongs to the nation.
And those factors correlate strongly with a preference for authoritarian structure.
While urban residents, being more cosmopolitan and socially liberal, reinforce the foundational preference for democratic ideals.
So to summarize this critical section, the movement away from democracy in rural areas is not primarily a grievance about being ignored by politicians.
No, it's a profound socioeconomic and cultural conflict rooted in fundamental differences in educational attainment, lifestyle, and core moral identity relative to urban areas.
With political discontent simply acting as the mirror for this deeper structural chasm.
That is the essential takeaway. The conflict is cultural and economic first, and only then does it manifest as political dissatisfaction.
This whole deep dive has really forced us to confront the limitations of our own biological hardware. We started with the colleague who couldn't reconcile the complex reality of the heartland with the simple myth in his head.
And we've established that the rural myth isn't an accident of ignorance. It's a predictable, system-wide outcome of running 21st century societal complexity on a brain optimized for managing, at most, 150 intimate social relationships.
This evolutionary mismatch compels us toward tribalistic simplification, the monolith trap.
Which in turn structurally disadvantages outgroups by providing the urban in-group with a psychological justification, the outgroup homogeneity effect, for disproportionate resource and cultural respect allocation.
We also saw that while the political divide often looks superficially small, the moment that place-based identity is activated, the division dramatically sharpens and political trust dangerously inverts.
That feeling of being culturally disrespected is an incredibly powerful engine for political alienation.
And finally, we discovered that the fundamental conflict driving the preference for non-democratic alternatives is not policy or political failure. It's a deep-seated chasm concerning socioeconomic standing, especially education, coupled with fundamental differences in core moral values and the ethnic conception of nationhood.
So the solution for democratic stability has to move beyond mere institutional fixes and address that profound feeling of social and cultural marginalization.
Despite the fact that our biases are deeply embedded in our biological heritage and that relying on the rural myth offers an irresistible form of evolutionary convenience by minimizing cognitive costs, recognizing this myth as a pervasive system glitch, a product of evolutionary mismatch, is the necessary first step toward installing the critical thinking software patch required to navigate a truly complex and interconnected global society.